Before we start into the finale of the Gary Hamel series, I want to thank our sponsor, Kyndryl. Kyndryl runs and reimagines technology systems that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses. With a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders to harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. They even got me a sign over my shoulder there. You can find out more about Kyndryl at KYNDRYL, Kyndryl.com. Today's book is a manifesto and a manual. It argues persuasively that it's time to free the human spirit from the shackles of bureaucracy, and that doing so will produce profound benefits for individuals, organizations, economies, and societies. It also gives management renegades practical strategies for advancing the cause of humanocracy within their own organizations. If you're ready to build an organization that's fit for human beings and fit for the future, this is the book for you. It's a new edition of this book, Humanocracy. A lot of people have been waiting for it. It's why we had a bit of a gap in our series on our guest, because he's launched a brand new edition of this book. He's currently recording the audiobook version of that. It's a fantastic book. Just look at the ratings on Amazon. Massive amount of ratings. 500 5-star ratings the last I saw. And it has been expanded with new examples, new case studies, and updated data about the problem of bureaucracy and the opportunities for humanocracy. It is a great pleasure to welcome back for our final book in the series, the author of Humanocracy, Gary Hamel. Welcome back.
Hi, Aidan. A great pleasure to be talking to you again.
It's great to have you back, Gary. And I thought, for completeness, I've called out the dedications that you have on the book. And this one is to Kelly Duhamel. So let's give her a bit of a shout out as well.
Thank you for that very, very much. It's a very personal story. I'll leave it at that. But thank you for that, Aidan. And thanks for persevering through all of this accumulated body of work.
It's an absolute privilege, man. I thought I'd just share with you some of the amazing call-outs people have had, particularly on LinkedIn. I just picked LinkedIn, and I can say their name because they've actually shared this content on LinkedIn. I don't know all these people. I've got to know some of them, but to a lady called Kathy Comfort, who shared on LinkedIn, I've just added up, I've spent over 14 hours listening to Gary Hamel on the Innovation Show podcast and discuss his books. And we haven't even got to Humanocracy yet, she says. Time well spent. Each one is packed with good stuff. One recent nugget that stuck in my head is the idea that habits can supersede values. Are your habits in line with your values? That's what you called out, and that's what she echoed. And then a gent that has listened from day one, but also that has gone and worked for one of the companies that you founded, Strategos, a gent called Craig Horton, and he said, I'm just listening to Leading the Revolution Part 3, Be Your Own Seer, halfway through, and have already made 8 pages of notes. So shout out to you, Craig. And finally, Patrick Lawler. So Patrick is from the Irish League of Credit Unions here in Ireland, and he wrote a post. It was his first time writing a post, Gary, and he quoted you on the show. And that article he wrote went absolutely viral. He said, as I was listening to Competing for the Future Part 2 with the author and strategy expert Gary Hamel, Gary said, walk towards the pain when the future looks difficult. Walk towards the unfamiliar. And he said, in the context of the credit union sector, history has shown that dominant players who fail to evolve often pay a steep price. And I just wanted to share those few of many messages I have received, a lot privately backstage, but they were all front stage. So tip of the hat to you, Gary. Bravo, sir.
Thank you.
Bravo.
Well, thank you, Aidan, for the wonderful platform you've provided. And as you so well know, people acquire information, learn in so many different ways today. And books are only one way. But it's always more fun just to have a conversation and talk about things, I guess, for most people than to dig through pages of a large book. So been super fun. And boy, we have a lot more to talk about too.
Huge amount to talk about. So let's talk about the state of the problem. So if you don't know what bureaucracy means, you certainly know what it feels like. It is particularly if you work in a large organization. Gary has updated since the first edition of Humanocracy to the latest edition, and a lot of the problems haven't gone away, Gary, in those
No.
2 years. A lot of them have exasperated.
They haven't gone away. We'll come back to this. I think there's a growing recognition. I'm actually fairly impressed by the number of CEOs who are now raising their hand and saying, yeah, we have a problem here. I think it remains to be seen whether they're doing the right things and going deep enough. And for me, writing this book and more broadly my work has grown out of my first person experience. I'm probably not going to say lived experience. Boy, isn't that an overworked phrase? But this is my experience with people who are deeply frustrated. Through my career, Aidan and I've had the chance to work with so many amazing people, like really smart, clever, committed people. And yet, when you see these people in organizational settings, you kind of say, like, why does it seem like everybody's walking around in lead boots, right? That no one is very eager to make a decision, that every meeting requires a pre-meeting, that if you want to do anything, literally almost anything, you got to get sign-offs from HR, legal, and so on. That often a small screw-up is regarded as a bigger risk than creeping irrelevance. That hard truths have to be packaged in bubble wrap before you can share them up or down the chain of command. That I think often the illusion of consensus is preferable to hard conversation. That while companies kind of celebrate diversity is good only so long as it doesn't produce genuine dissent, that what people will call a transformation program leaves 90% of the status quo untouched. That alignment is celebrated even when everybody's walking off a cliff. That we call people leaders when everybody knows they don't have many willing followers. That we have all these corporate rituals like performance management, which everybody knows is basically theater, has very little impact. That we willingly, knowingly mistake activity for impact. All of these things are realities people live with every day. And in some sense, if you work in almost any sort of an organization, to some degree, you have Stockholm syndrome, right? I mean, you kind of just given in and said, like, I can't fight back and I'm just going to like whatever. But no, nobody should have to live in an organization where those kinds of things are true. So for me, that's where this all starts, not as like some strategic issue or somewhere. It's just like life is too short to work in organizations where any or often all of those things are true.
And one of the things you say, and this will speak to the very soul of so many of these listeners of this show, is that in a bureaucracy, to be a maverick is a high-risk occupation. Worst of all, bureaucracies are soul-crushing, deprived of any real influence. Employees disconnect emotionally from their work. Initiative, creativity, and daring, requisites for success in the creative economy, get left at home. And I witnessed that, Gary. I worked in an organization and I didn't last long. I was 8 months there, but I felt stuff that I'd previously been able to do in a more entrepreneurial environment. It was like now I was wearing a fat suit and I could barely touch my toes. And like you said, there was 10 meetings to the ratio of one meeting in the other place. In fact, in the other place, you didn't even do meetings. You just took action. And that's where actually the show was born from, was actually, I got given out to for starting the show. They were like, we were supposed to meet about this.
I want to come back on that point, Aidan. That's a really great analogy, like walking around in a fat suit. I want to come back because like one of the questions is, why is this persisted? And maybe we've touched on this, but maybe I can go a little deeper this time. Why is this persisted despite all of our frustration? I don't know if I shared this anecdote, and if I did, you'll just cut this out. But let's take a risk for a moment. I'm going to talk for a moment about gynecology and about my wife. So like, what could go wrong with that? But my wife is a gynecologist and obstetrician, has delivered about 5,000 babies. And this is just like a personal experience, that one tiny experience that brings all of this home. You know, she, with about 4 or 5 other partners, women doctors, they built this amazing practice over many years, had highly satisfied patients. They loved them. And so great practice, and they made a good living out of it and so on. And so like a lot of physician practices in North America. This got acquired a few years back by a giant hospital group. And a few months into it, maybe a year into it, they get a note from the finance person of this big hospital group saying, "We noticed your practice is like losing money, and we needed to talk about this." And of course, the physicians who built the practice, like how could that be? Like, we're as productive as we've ever been. Our billings are strong. Like, we haven't added any more staff. Like, what's going on here? So they get a meeting set up, and CFO comes in and says, "Let me take you through the data." So he puts up a one-pager P&L summary, and sure enough, it's like a $500,000 loss. Well, what the heck? And so immediately what he said to them is, "You guys got to cut some costs." And so what we'd argue is, instead of having so many nurses, see if you can get like a lower level provider, maybe medical assistants or somebody else, and see if you can reduce some staff there and get some lower. Wait. And the physicians are like, "No, wait a minute. These nurses are incredibly skilled. They're often the ones who are answering the phone calls in the middle of the night. They save us a huge amount of time. Let's us be more productive." And the guy says, "We have a rule that you only want so many nurses for so many physicians, and you seem to be overstaffed." So these 5 ladies say, like, "Can we go a little deeper here? Because this is not making any sense to us." So they spend the next hour or so like going deep through this P&L, and finally discover a one-line charge called corporate services for $500,000. And they go like, "What the hell is that?" And the guy says, without embarrassment or blushing, he says, "Well, everybody has to support their share of corporate overhead." And I go like, "That overhead adds zero value to us. Like, why are you taxing us for a bunch of VPs sitting that like don't do anything for us?" So you can imagine it's a fairly kind of contentious meeting. But that just happens every day in all kinds of organizations where we layer on these costs with very uncertain benefits. And we'll talk about why that happens and why it grows. But boy, how demotivating for a group of people who built something, are highly successful, and then suddenly you find you're being taxed for a bunch of suits that aren't adding any value. So just a little case study.
Soul crushing is the exact word that you use in the book. There was one piece I just wanted to pull out, and it's just because it connects to something that you had planted the seed of earlier on in the whole series. You said, at the time of writing of this, the world contains 433 unicorns, venture-backed companies that boast a market value of over $1 billion or more. While these companies get a lot of press, they are a relatively small part of the respective economies in which they sit. In early 2020, US-backed unicorns had a combined value of over $650 billion. That seems like a big number, but at the time amounted to just slightly more than 2% of the combined market value of the S&P 500. And this is the key point. While entrepreneurial enclaves like Silicon Valley are important, we need to find ways to turn up the entrepreneurial flame in every organization. I think that if there's anything else, and a drive from sharing this work, it's to save those bigger companies that have often become bureaucracies, because we actually need them. We need them for society. We need them for jobs. I don't know if you saw last week that the Wall Street Journal published a swathe of companies that are letting go of lots of people to prefer smaller teams and teams that are more broad skilled that can use AI.
Yeah, so let's a couple of things there. So the first thing is, there has been, and rightly so, a great hope that startups will revitalize our economies. They'll hold the big companies to account, create new jobs, create new wealth. And that's certainly happened, but nowhere near fast enough or broadly enough to make up for the lack of dynamism in a lot of these, even medium-sized and larger, let me say longer-lived. It's less about size maybe than how long they've been around, but in some of these longer-lived companies. And I think the data, we can update that a little bit. I think at the moment, U.S. unicorns are about 4.5% of the value, and that includes like big unicorns like SpaceX, about 4.5% of the S&P 500. I think in Europe, if you take EU, Switzerland, and Great Britain, the unicorns there are worth about 1.5% of the European S&P 350. So those are not big numbers. Of course, some of these companies we hope will grow up and one day be extraordinarily impactful. Having said that, if you look at in the U.S. stock market, like the Magnificent Seven, the Amazon, NVIDIA, Apple, and so on of this world, but that have largely driven the performance of the U.S. stock market, right? Way overweighted in terms of their impact on the U.S. stock market. The average age of those companies is 33 years, right? These are not young companies. And like, where's the next Mag 7? Well, maybe it'll come, but we've been waiting for quite some time. And we might have mentioned this before. Let's come back to this because I'll give you the exact data. But there's a lot of evidence that large companies are becoming more entrenched. And we'll talk about this specifically. And that it's harder for newcomers to penetrate those defenses. So, yeah, you cannot build a dynamic economy in Ireland, Great Britain, Germany, United States, anywhere around the world, unless, most of your institutions are truly dynamic, including the biggest ones, particularly the biggest ones. So that's an absolute fact. Now, the thing about kind of the current preference for delayering and downsizing, this obviously goes in cycles, right? We go all the way back. And every time, you have a recession or times get tough, companies do that. The problem, Aidan, is it's often like mowing the grass. Like they do it, and yet without some like deeper, more fundamental change, like grass just grows back. And then a decade or two later, you have the same problem. Got kind of curious of this current enthusiasm for delayering. I put that term to Google Ngram, which kind of gives you a measure of how popular some of these words are in books and so on. And so I put in organizational delayering, and there was a huge uptick in that back in the early 2000s after the dot-com boom and so on, and then a bit with the financial boom. And then like the thing just completely disappears again. Like nobody's talking about it. So we're going to go through that, thing again. Will we have deeper, more fundamental change this time? I think the jury is still out, and we're going to talk about how do you ensure you really do have deep and permanent change. But experience suggests that we'll kind of take some costs out, we'll flatten it a bit, but we really won't change the organization in a fundamental way. And that's what I'm going to argue we have to do.
With Gary's permission, I have a few graphs that I'd love Gary to talk us through, and I'll just give you a little bit of an excerpt to tee this one up. Bureaucracy's tumor-like growth, I love this writing, has coincided with a notable slowdown in productivity growth. Over the past decade, U.S. non-farm productivity grew by just 1.7% a year and a meager 1.9% annually since 1970. And this compares poorly with the 2.8% rate of growth achieved between 1909 and 1969. Most of the world's major economies have experienced similar declines, and that's what Gary's going to speak to. Hopefully those people, you're watching us on YouTube. If you're not, Gary will just give people a bit of empathy to describe what we're looking at here. In a time where we're actually getting rid of jobs, I felt that was really important, and we'll talk about companies like particularly Nucor and the broad skill basis that they hire for actually learnability, because they know people are going to have to change roles throughout the company as well. I'm just planting that seed now. But really interestingly, Gary, I listened to the audiobook of Humanocracy as well as read it, and I was listening because I was traveling a lot recently, and I also vary between that. I listened to some old Andy Grove lectures that are online, but I also listened to the late Donella Meadows, who was the systems thinking lady. And she talks about nature, and you just brought it to mind speaking about it there. She talked about in systems thinkers, they never blame people. They blame the systems in which they're couched. So she said, like, the systems we live in at the moment are very broken. And I thought it was a perfect segue, because you suggest a new management model, which is essentially a system, because one of the beliefs of humanocracy versus bureaucracy is the actual system of how a company is run is broken for the times that we're in today. So I'm showing on the screen here the management model that Gary recommends for humanocracy. Maybe you'll talk us through this one, Gary.
Again, the context here is, I think there are three equally valid and critical reasons for saying we need to fundamentally rethink how our organizations are run. There's a social reason that it's just iniquitous to waste as much human capacity as we're doing. I think there's a competitive reason. You see a set of companies coming out of China, Xiaomi, Haier, BYD, Huawei, and so on, who basically aren't starting with the old bureaucratic model. They're starting with the idea that however big an organization is, it has to maintain this entrepreneurial energy. And they're succeeding, I think, in many ways in doing that. So there's definitely a competitive challenge here. You can't have a resilient society without resilient organizations. And there's an economic challenge, which this speaks to. So it's really kind of amazing, Aidan, if you look, again, over the last 20, 30 years, what we see is declining productivity growth dramatically across the entire G7. So that data you see in the US is exactly the same line for all major economies. And the implications of that, as any economist or central banker or whatever would tell you, are very, very profound. Because if you have slowing productivity growth, that means you are not creating the excess wealth in a society that allows you to fund education, healthcare, environment, defense, and all these other things that we need to fund. Most governments in developed countries are now in some kind of a fiscal crisis. With one or two exceptions, state borrowing is at an all-time high. Governments are faced with these impossible choices about, do we fund defense or do we fund healthcare and so on? And unless you're creating constantly, productivity is growing, you just end up with a set of very politically difficult trade-offs. And obviously, standards of living do not go up in that environment overall. The wealthy can still do very, very well, and they have done very, very well. Let's come back to that. But overall, slowing productivity growth means you're probably going to also have more wage disparity with all the political implications that brings. And what's kind of ironic, I would argue, is that productivity slowdown, Aidan, has come at the same time we're investing records amount in information technology. And so we're spending close now in current dollars, we're spending a little bit less than $4 trillion a year globally on information technology. And that has kind of doubled over the last 20 years in real terms. So you're like, how the heck is IT investment is going like this and productivity is going the other way? And this is a super complicated issue. A lot of people have opinions on this. I certainly would not argue that technology isn't helping productivity, but to the extent that it is, and I think that extent is often overrated, to the extent that it is, there are other things that are absorbing those gains, that are offsetting those gains. And without getting into a long discussion about where AI may go, if you think about, okay, what did we see over the last, I'm old enough now to remember this. You look over the last 50 some years and wave after wave of kind of technology change, and from semiconductors to mainframe computers to personal computers to the smartphone to GPS to data analytics to big data to cloud computing, 5G and whatever. And that's all great. But all of those technologies collectively, and we still have declining productivity growth. So you'd have to believe that AI is going to do something that 50 years of other technologies, very consequential technologies like e-commerce, have somehow not managed to do. And I think that's a fairly, AI, we're all going to use it. It's going to be transformative in many ways. But I'm a little skeptical that by itself is going to make much of a difference to productivity growth. And a lot of the people who've looked at this deeply, Nobel Prize winning economists, have come to the same conclusion, that it's unlikely. So that's a problem. And we'll dig into this, but my sense, and probably the only way we're going to turn that slow productivity decline, we're going to turn that around, is we have to get fundamentally better at using human ingenuity, human initiative, and we can no longer just afford to squander it the way we might once have done. In the same way that 20, 30 years ago, nobody was caring about how much carbon we pumped into the atmosphere or what we were doing to our rivers and our lakes and the ocean. And then you say, okay, crap, this is unsustainable, right? We got to turn this thing around. Well, I think we're in a similar position. We've grown accustomed to this enormous waste of human capacity. But okay, no, we can't just be content with that any longer, because our future prosperity depends, and as well as our leadership in a lot of critical next generation industries depends on creating more dynamic organizations that better use the people within them. So that little slide there, that is the economic, for me, that's why economically what we're talking about here is so fundamentally important.
In a time where we're actually getting rid of jobs, I felt that was really important. And we'll talk about companies like particularly Nucor and the broad skill basis that they hire for actually learnability, because they know people are going to have to change roles throughout the company as well. I'm just planting that seed now. But really interestingly, Gary, I listened to the audiobook of Humanocracy as well as read it. And I was listening because I was traveling a lot recently. And I also varied between that. I listened to some old Andy Grove lectures that are online, but I also listened to the late Donella Meadows, who was the systems thinking lady. And she talks about nature, and you just brought it to mind speaking about it there. In systems thinkers, they never blame people. They blame the systems in which they're couched. So she said the systems we live in at the moment are very broken. And I thought it was a perfect segue, because you suggest a new management model, which is essentially a system, because one of the beliefs of humanocracy versus bureaucracy is the actual system of how a company is run is broken for the times that we're in today. So I'm showing on the screen here the management model that Gary recommends for humanocracy. Maybe you'll talk us through this one, Gary.
Most people today are very familiar with the idea of a business model, right? What's the value proposition? What's the product? What channels are you going to go through? What's your pricing strategy? All those elements that comprise a business model. But maybe we talk a little bit less about the management model, which is just all the system structures and processes we use to run our organization. And, I've tried to break that down here into kind of the typical major elements. We have some kind of an innovation system. We certainly have a lot of financial management, people management, our planning, our performance management, and so on. And then underneath that is kind of architecture of the structures we use and how we divide up the tasks, how we define them, the internal networks and so on, and information technology. So the argument I think we're going to have here, or the discussion, Aidan, is we have to be able to completely reimagine every element of this. And that, all of these things in a kind of traditional organization, a bureaucratic organization, all of these systems hang together, right? This is an integrated piece. And they all share information, and a lot of processes cut across here. And most importantly, they're all based, and we'll come back to this, but they're all based on the same set of kind of bureaucratic principles of routinization, formalization, standardization, specialization, stratification, and so on. And if you see organizations all struggling in similar ways, then there's something that's rather deep and fundamental to that. And I think it's the management model. Now, this is a generic representation of that. But when you dig into all these structures and systems, what you find is they're all built on that old bureaucratic model, that assumption that power trickles down, that big leaders appoint little leaders, that people cannot manage themselves, that more control is always better than less control, that control is best to come from oversight and rules and policies, that what people really care about is promotion, and that's the game we're going to play, is we're all going to... all those assumptions are deeply buried into this management model. And to your point there, where you started about thinking of this as a system, we'll talk at some point about Bill Anderson, who led this amazing transformation within Roche Pharmaceuticals, the second biggest pharma company in the world, and is now in the midst of doing something similar, maybe even bolder, at Bayer in Germany. And one of the things he said, and I don't have the quote in front of me, but I'll give you a pretty close approximation. When they started it, he said, we had tried a lot of things over many years, and people were still telling me we couldn't get things done. And so he said, we could have done a next round of kind of process updates and transformational this and that. And he said, it would have been totally demoralizing because we've been doing that for a long, long time, and it wasn't changing anything fundamental. And then he said this, I had to admit that something was wrong with the whole system. Now, that is a really profound thing to say, because it's saying there's no way we can build a fundamentally more capable organization with point solutions. Because what CEOs often want is, just tell me that one thing we need to change. I'll give that as an assignment to some vice president, EVP. They'll go talk to the consultants and come back in 6 months and tell me, like, this is fixed, right? And what Bill was saying is, no, everything has to change. Somebody at Roche also put it another way. They said, we're going to have to tear everything back to the studs. In other words, just the basic framing of this thing. Everything else comes out. And now, that sounds like that's impossible, or that would be hugely disruptive, or that could go terribly wrong, and you bring an organization to its knees. So we can come back and a bit later we'll talk about, like, how do you do that without blowing things up and taking big operational risks. But if you don't start by saying the old model is broken, like everywhere, and we have to search for something there. If you don't start there, you will end up with small incremental fixes that will change nothing. And that's my concern with the current kind of delayering and downsizing. Okay, I've seen that movie a few times in my career. So we'll see where that leads. But I think that's why you really do have to take a system perspective. And the dilemma is, the moment you say, let's think about the system, you're talking about something that's very complex and very interrelated and was built over a long time. And I think just the idea of trying to change the system is immensely daunting to many leaders.
And has very little reward, Gary, as well. I think in the short term, and that thing about the short term, that the lifespan of leaders has got less. One of the things I picked up is that leaders are a little bit older. I think 3 years older than they used to be, but their lifespans as leaders is less. So this whole idea of why would I bother taking on such a big challenge? Because it's often not rewarded from stakeholders, shareholders, board members.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you can kind of blame it on the shareholders or so on, but you know, most of the stakeholders, they're not content with where the system is either. And I think, as we'll see, you can make these changes without. These are hard changes to make. They're not necessarily expensive changes to make, nor are they going to blow things up. So if you assume that deep change, and this is an assumption based on kind of the way we change and the change model we've used in the past. But if you start with an assumption that every deep change is going to be highly disruptive to the organization and take way longer than what we were promised and whatever, then you go like, my God, like, it was hard enough when we just changed the IT system and we went to private cloud or something. My God, you're saying we're so you also, and again, something we'll talk about, you have to find a very different way of changing. Because yeah, if like, who's going to do something that's this hard? But even when we change small things, you know, we basically end up, you know, in cardiac arrest. But, and I will also say, in the organizations where I've tracked this and looked at these long change processes and helped to lead them on occasion, the gains come very quickly, right? There's so much potentiality in an organization that when you kind of take off the lid on the pressure cooker, it's not that like, oh my gosh, you know, we're gonna have to wait a year before we get a payoff. You know, like no. You give people a little bit more freedom. You teach them to think a little bit more like business people. You get some bureaucracy out of the way. Things will start to get better, like super, super fast. So again, this is not like, hey, we're gonna spend 10 years investing in some technology and hope it works. This is like, no, let's just get a few things out of the way. The payoff comes almost immediately. But if you want it to be a DNA level change and persist, and for that bureaucratic crap never to grow back, yeah, then it's going to take perseverance.
I wanted to just as well explain, the examples are so clear and they're so well laid out. Nucor, you know, Nucor empower everybody to be entrepreneurial. Hire for me was, well, actually empower them to be entrepreneurs. And there were system changes, there were reward changes, there were accountability changes, there were upskilling people, investing in that upskilling, flattening the organization, listening to the edges. And they are, like, as you say, they're not massive changes. They're just changes in the way you do things, and your change as you as a leader to be able to empower those things. And I thought it was important, Gary, as well, before we go into any examples or build on this, to explain the difference between Humanocracy, because I don't know if anybody who hasn't read this book knows this, that it's not just a catchy title. It's actually an operating system for how you need to be versus a bureaucracy. So there's a diagram again in the book where Gary shows the difference between both. But I'd love you to share this, Gary, and tell
So, but I also want to come back. So remind me, because there's a couple of things we touched on earlier. I should probably amplify. But one of the things I argue in the book is that you reach a point in any field of human endeavor where you can't solve the new problems with the old principles. So there are many classic examples. I'll maybe give a couple quick ones. So if you are John Locke in the early 17th century and you start to think about individual sovereignty, not of the state, the monarch, but of individual, nobody probably really ever had that thought before in human history. And it wasn't only John Locke, but there are other people that kind of emerged as this idea out of the Enlightenment. And then you go, okay, like, wow. So what does that mean in terms of self-government? So that new worldview points you to a new problem, like how can people govern themselves? And then you end up with the idea of democracy. So I think we're at a point where what we really need is not better practices and processes. We need better thinking and better starting principles and a better starting worldview. And I'd like to come back and we'll talk about this in a slightly more structured way. But let me say that the worldview, and we'll talk to this thing you have here, the diagram, for most of us, kind of our worldview, our paradigmatic assumptions. Why do people go to work? Why do organizations exist? What's the purpose of capitalism, right? Those beliefs are so deeply embedded in the zeitgeist, right, that we never question them. We inherited them, but we never question them, right? So one of the deepest beliefs of all in that old bureaucratic model is that individuals are instruments. So the institution, a business school, a bank, whatever, they hire people to produce some kind of output, probably services, products, and profit. And in that view, the human being is a tool. And that's why we call them human resources, right? Terrible word or phrase, human capital. And so, if you've ever been in a relationship where you are seen as an instrument, right? Like sometimes people call me a tool, but I think they meant something else. I'm not sure what that was, but whatever. But if you are seen as an instrument, like that's a bad relationship, right? You're just a means for somebody else to get what they want, right? And you are incidental to their needs, and you just are in service to their needs. But that thinking, that view of human beings at work is deeply, deeply embedded in that bureaucratic model. You hear leaders say, well, my people. I'm like, how are they your people? Right? We do not have slavery. So almost all of the organizations, what I would call kind of the post-bureaucratic pioneers who are showing us a different way, they start with that second model. And we'll come back to how does that work out in all kinds of system structures, processes. But they start with a belief that it is the institution that's the instrument, not the human being. So I joined the London Business School. I don't think the London Business School hired me. I had more than one choice. But I saw them as a wonderful platform with colleagues and students and helping me make an impact in the world. And, and I think that's how most young people view work today. And to the extent they view work as a necessary evil and, something like, okay, fine, I got to do it. Well, then they're in an organization that's still managing that old model. If they see it as, wow, this is an amazing place to work where I can solve really interesting problems and make an impact in the world and, yes, earn a living. So I think, this looks like a very subtle switch, right? Like, what's the instrument here? What's the tool? But that shift in mindsets is at the core of everything that you see in these vanguard organizations. We'll talk about Nucor. But it's interesting, I was talking to one of their past CEOs. He said, they operate in a lot of fairly impoverished rural areas across America. They use the local workforce. These are not people who've been to, Ivy League schools and have all kinds of credentials, but they get extraordinary results. And he said, we never think we're in the business of building steel. We're in the business of building people. And if you build people, you build communities. And if you build a great community, you can build a great company. And you go like, wow, that's like, how many companies would start with that, right? And so I just think so often, Aidan, we have it like ass backwards, right? So it's like we start from that output and then work back. Okay, yeah, we need some people and whatever. And yeah, that will just never, you'll never have a truly great institution over the long term with that point of view. So there are other kind of much more practical differences between that bureaucratic, but that's perhaps the most foundational. And when you start there with that kind of worldview, it points you in different directions. So the bureaucratic worldview, the problem to solve was, how do we maximize compliance for the sake of efficiency? Which is, by the way, a very interesting problem to solve. If most of your employees are illiterate and you're trying to scale up something in your Ford or your whatever, and you need people to show up on time and do what they're told and, not drink on the job and, okay, yeah, like we got to figure out how to get compliance. But I would argue today, the problem is not how do you maximize compliance for the sake of efficiency, but how do you maximize contribution for the sake of impact? Efficiency is table stakes, right? So, and we know a lot about what drives human achievement, and we are using almost none of what we know inside of our organization. So, but let me just come back very briefly to one other thing. You had the diagram up on declining productivity. Well, what's also happened over that last 30, 40 years is the growth of the administrative and managerial class. So in the United States, and I might have shared this data at some point, Aidan, but we definitely need to come back to this. If you look since 1983, and I can give you data for the UK, Germany, different countries, but since 1983, the number of administrative and managerial jobs in the U.S. workforce has grown by 150%. And all other categories, as you see here, all of the job categories have grown by about 50%. And, okay, so, and by the way, if you look at this from a micro basis, my colleague McCullen has been doing this. Just about every large organization, revenue per vice president is going down because we're adding vice presidents faster than we're growing the company. And so, and by the way, this is super, super typical. What happens in almost every organization is you reach an inflection point fairly early on where bureaucracy starts growing faster than the organization itself. So more rules, more procedures, more administrators, more managers, and so on. And that never reverses until one day there's a crisis and something dramatic changes. So what you see in this, by the way, if I showed you the data right now for UK civil service, you see exactly the same data. Number of administrators up by about 150%. Number of managers is kind of doubled. And all other employment in the UK civil service is flat over the last 20 years. And so we're just adding more and more bureaucracy. And so causality is a little difficult to prove here. But I'm at least suspicious, Aidan, that if you look at the growth of bureaucracy going one way and productivity growth going the other way, maybe there's something we got to look at here. And so you do come back, I think, to quite an interesting question, like, why has bureaucracy continued? Like, why does this thing seem untamable, right? Because obviously it doesn't grow absent human intentions, right? There's not some malevolent force out there that is like doing this. We're doing this to ourselves.
The thing, Gary, I don't get, and maybe it's because I've tasted what it's like not to do that type of work, is that the people who get into those jobs, I mean, it's meaningless. There's no, as you talk about, there's no noble quest. There's no driving vision for that work. I know you need administration, you need some administration and bureaucracy, but when that becomes protectionism of those roles for no other goal other than to have the roles, it must be demoralizing to be in the role because you're living in stress and you're living in misery, unless you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah, I think that's true, Aidan. Now, it's amazing as human beings, we're able to get acclimated to all kinds of very substandard. People will stay in a bad relationship for years and years and years because of the inertia. But I think you're right. I've often said that I've never met a 12-year-old who says they want to grow up to be a manager. So, when I'm talking to managers, I got to tell them, like, somewhere you guys took a wrong turn. Like, I don't know what happened to you, but like this was never your vision of your best life. So it's important to understand like how we got there. And let me provide just a little bit of context there. Like, one of the reasons we got there is, if you go back 100 and some years when, we were starting to build large scale organizations, administrative skills were very, very rare. So understanding how to be a manager, like how to do a budget and how to put together a plan and how to motivate people and how to keep track of their work and how to do task design, all the stuff that Peter Drucker wrote about his whole career, that was super, super rare all those years ago, all those decades ago. It was like being a geneticist or a data scientist, AI expert today. And so at that time, that was like a pretty cool, exotic thing to be. And, and was really stretching. That's like not true anymore. So why is it that this thing continues to expand like an invasive species with no natural predators, local predators? So I think there's several reasons. I just ask our listeners to kind of reflect on this for a moment and say, like, does Gary have this right or not? And if they don't, or if you see something else going on, maybe put it in the comments here. But one, in most organizations, at some point, the only way you can move farther in your career is to join the managerial ranks. So, because, at the top of an organization, it's all managers. Now, they can be managers of marketing and finance, whatever, but it's no longer just technical expertise. Now, I am somebody who most of my time is spent managing other people who may or may not need managing, but that's my job. So, inevitably, you push people into those roles, whether they want to be in that role or not. And many of them don't. Or they took one for the team. Somebody left. They said, okay, yeah, crap, we have to have a manager. I'll go do that job. And those are also universally the jobs that are the best paid. If you want to move up in an organization at some point, the only choice is to make that shift into an administrative or managerial role. So that's one reason this keeps. And because they tend to be higher paid, if you want to reward people, you create more of those jobs, which is one of those reasons we're creating managerial jobs far faster, because we're not paying the people on the front lines anymore. So if you're exceptional and you want somebody to recognize them, you move them into these roles. So that's number one. I think number two, once you kind of have that bureaucratic mindset, your solution to every new problem is more bureaucracy. So we're in a world where there are problems proliferating all the time, and you see a new problem. What does it mean? We need another CXO. We need more reporting. We need new rules. We need new policies and so on. So as the world becomes more complex, we don't say, hey, is there a better way to deal with complexity? We just keep adding more bureaucracy because that's what we do. I think thirdly, and this is really rather pernicious, but again, let people tell me whether I got this right. I think bureaucracies offer a lot of jobs that are a safe haven from genuine accountability. So there are a lot of jobs in bureaucracies where you are not really accountable to truly the outside world. And there are all kinds of things between you and the customer, the stakeholders, the shareholders, and so on. So you've negotiated a set of KPIs or other targets internally with other people that are often proxies for real value added. And pardon me if I use this example before, Aidan, but one of the things I put up on Excellence is a little question. I said, would you rather have a job as chief revenue officer or head of sales in your organization? Let's say it's well paid $500,000 a year, or as head of training and development, also $500,000 a year. And most people want the training and development job because it's hard to measure value added. So, bureaucracies cultivate mediocrity because so many roles, they really are not directly accountable and nobody can fire you. I think, another reason is those who've done well in a bureaucratic model, those who've learned how to play the game, who've learned how to manage up and negotiate targets and so on and so on. Why do they want to change it? Right? I mean, if you're a great footballer, you probably don't want to play rugby or badminton. So even though you may find a lot of leaders say, yeah, bureaucracy kind of sucks. Really? Are you really willing? If that's what you've learned how to do and that is what got you ahead, you really want to kind of fundamentally undo that, which kind of leads to the fifth and last thing. Bureaucracy is just a way of allocating power at one level. And, people who have power are reluctant to give it up. And we'll give you reasons why they need more of it. And the number of reasons, we have to make sure everybody's doing it the same way. Right? We need to have only one way of doing it, one system, and I'm going to run it. So I think, that's it. We force people to manage your roles. We look at every new problem and try to solve it through bureaucratic means. Bureaucracy gives people kind of protection from their own mediocrity in a way. The people who've done well by it want to keep it. And, if you have a lot of power, you're near the top, you're not going to give it away. And I think maybe there's other things, but I think those are the primary reasons this whole thing has been so sticky. I mean, the question I'd maybe like people to reflect on is, how does bureaucracy show up in your organization? How do you experience that every day in ways that slow you down, kind of undermine your commitment, undermine your enthusiasm, make collaboration difficult, reward the wrong behaviors? Because we really we're going to talk about how to solve this. For sure, I don't want to leave people hanging on this, but as you talked about today, Aidan, the starting point is you got to say the system is broken. You got to admit that. One of the questions I ask CEOs, I say, can you imagine an organization that is as different from the bureaucratic model as ChatGPT is different from Google search, or as Netflix is different from the BBC? And so, opening your minds to at least the idea that there may be a radical alternative, being willing to say, yeah, we have to change the whole damn system, sorry to say. For me, those are the critical starting points on this journey. And so we'll get to the practicality and whatever. But if you're not there yet, if you can't say the system is broken, there's no plaster, no bandage, we're just not going to solve it that way. You can't solve obesity through amputation. And number two, and you know what? Maybe there's something fundamentally better out there. Once you open your mind to those two things, genuine progress is possible. Until that point, you're stuck.
I just wanted some Ozempic. You took my arms, man.
Or better yet, get on the damn treadmill and exercise. I used the term many years ago back in Competing for the Future. I called it corporate anorexia.
Yeah.
And I mean, you don't starve your way to health, but a diet sometimes is useful.
Yeah. Gary, I thought we'd leave with a moment of hope and beautiful case study. And I'm sure a lot of people use this company's products, but never know what they do, or certainly not the name of the company. But I'll just be as a contrast. Gary mentions as well at the end of part one, the former CEO of SAP, Jim Hagemann Snabe, I think that's how you say his name, discovered at the end of his tenure with SAP that the company was using, get a load of this, 5,000 at least KPIs, key performance indicators, covering every single job across the company. And he was horrified. He said, we were trying to run the company by remote control and we had all this amazing talent, but had asked them to put their brains on ice. And we are told to do this. KPIs, they're important and all that. We need some type of measure to see if we're making progress, but it can absolutely be paralyzing. And an absolute difference, a total other side of the coin, is a decentralized model. And that's the one of Morningstar and Chris Rufer, who is the CEO, founder, and president of that company. I'd love you to tell us about this as a moment of hope and what's possible.
Yeah, it is. It's like super amazing and super hopeful. And yeah, that 5,000 KPIs, I don't want to cast aspersion, but it does reflect a certain kind of arrogance that, like, we're smart enough to deconstruct success into all these major subsidiary measures and so on. And if everybody just does and hits their numbers like it's going to happen. And of course, the dilemma with that is you end up with an organization where people feel they only need to meet that target and they don't need to do more. So you've actually capped the organization's performance. And number two, if the world changes, they're still going to try to meet that target. So Morningstar is very different. It's the company that probably started me now 15, 17, 18 years ago, before I worked with Hire or anything else. It started me down this quest. Somebody told me about the world's largest tomato processor. This is not a glamorous high-tech industry. It's maybe about 150 miles from where I'm sitting talking to you today. It's out in the Central Valley of California, one of the most verdant agricultural regions of the world. And unlike basically every other vanguard I will talk about, it was started with somebody with an MBA, came out of a traditional business school, but didn't like what he learned. And Chris Rufer, by the way, he's not the CEO. He's the president, the founder, the owner. But he said, like, why am I the CEO? We need a president legally. You have to have a, legal, but like, I'm not the CEO. But anyway, so he built a model based on self-management. And like, this was way before like almost anybody was talking about this. I'm guessing this started maybe in the 80s at the latest. And so they have an organization. I can't tell you right now how many employees they have. It's several hundred, 400 or 500 employees. They are the largest tomato processor in the world. So if you've had, spaghetti sauce or salsa or ketchup or whatever, and they export all over the world, and they are unbelievably productive. They bought out a lot of their other competitors, and they're just the best in the world. And so when I went to I learned a little bit when I went there, it was like the craziest thing. First of all, they have no managers at all, like zero. Everybody, they're organized into teams, and people write contracts with their peers. So let's say I'm responsible for unloading and sorting tomatoes as they come off the trucks out of the fields. So I'll write a contract that is with the truckers of how quickly I'm going to get the stuff off of their truck because they want to get going again. My contract will also have responsibilities to downstream because I need to have these things sorted and make sure we don't have a lot of bad product going through. So I have a network of accountability to my peers, and that is all recorded in some detail. These contracts will run to several pages. They have thousands of these across the company. Everyone can be seen by everybody. So there's no mystery what I'm supposed to be doing and how my peers are going to hold me accountable. And the compensation system is quite interesting. And again, this may have evolved since I was there. So I'm giving you what I learned at the time. I'm not trying to tell you this is how they're doing now. But at that time, they had local compensation committees, councils, a couple of dozen of them. And, at the end of the year, everybody has a chance to come say, here's how I did against my contract. And their peers can say, like, Gary exceeded like here, or I didn't. And then they try to make sure that correlates with wages. And as with Nucor and some of these other companies, they don't have the best kind of base wages, but based on productivity and contribution, these people are within that industry, well, paid above the average. It's also interesting, like how they deal with underperformance. So if somebody thinks that I'm not living up to my contract, they call it a CLOU agreement, colleague letter of understanding. So CLOU, CLOU agreement, hundreds of them. So if somebody says, Gary, you're not living up to your agreement, and they come and kind of remonstrate with me about that and take me on, we probably will come, I fell down a little bit, I'm sorry, let me see what I can. But if we disagree, then we both can ask somebody else to come in and kind of adjudicate and listen to us and see like what needs to happen. If we still can't agree and there's serious concerns about my performance, then they bring together like a jury of 6 of your peers who look at all the evidence. And in some cases, those peers will fire you. And, if you've been fired by 6 of your colleagues, you're pretty thoroughly fired, right? I mean, you can't say, I had a personality conflict with my boss. Like, you weren't doing your job. So you start to think about, okay, this is a process capital intensive industry, highly integrated, down to the whole production process, and they're running it without any managers at all. And every employee has the company's checkbook. So if I need an upgrade to the boiler cooking these tomatoes, and it's going to cost me $500,000, there's literally nobody in purchasing, nobody in engineering to go ask. I have to sit down, figure that out, go find the vendors, and get it done. And again, knowing that if I get this decision wrong, it affects everybody's bonus, I'm going to go ask a few people and make sure, like, I've talked to my colleagues. Because again, if I do something stupid, there's a lot of accountability. There's just no managers. I also, in talking to Chris, the founder, I said, Chris, how do people get ahead at Morningstar? Because there's no ladder to climb. He said, Gary, what a silly question. He said, how do you get ahead on the PGA Tour? You get better. He says, so everybody here knows who are the most important. This is not like a flat organization. If you ask people, who are the 10 people who are most important to our leadership, our success, you're going to get the same names popping up again and again. And everybody wants to ensure those people are well paid and they stay here. But you don't get ahead by, satisfying your boss. You get ahead by doing great work. So again, it was very interesting to see a company that challenged one of the most fundamental assumptions of all, and that is you need managers to manage. And when I wrote the first article about this, Aidan, for Harvard Business Review, I had a battle with an editor who's no longer there anymore because what was really
fired by his peers.
I don't know what happened. He went on to greener pastures. I won't name names, but the interesting question to me was not, well, how does self-management work? Well, yeah, that's interesting. The much more interesting question is, how the hell did you ever end up with that model, right? I mean, okay, fine. And turns out, and there are other ways to get there, but Chris Rufer is kind of a libertarian and has just this unshakable belief in the value of human freedom. And what he said was, how do I build an organization that maximizes freedom with accountability? And so in writing up the piece, I had a whole little section on, the deep values that he had about freedom and individual accountability and so on. And the editor says, we can't put that in. This is not a philosophical piece. What is all this value? This is so. And I lost that battle. But that's the whole story. The whole story is, if you do not start with a different set of principles and a different view of human beings, views our earlier conversation, you are never going to end up with a management model like that. Or you'll have some pale limitation. Or you'll put a few of those things in and they'll soon disappear. So, yeah. So, it's like, you go back 100 and some years, the first time somebody saw an airplane flying, you only need to see it once to go, okay, gravity may always win, but not at every moment, at every point. Sometimes you can get up here and so all you have to see is, I don't have to see 10 companies like Morningstar. I have to see one and go oh, and they have unbelievable, by the way, they train everybody in financial modeling. So they're telling me our blue collar employees are better at doing NPV calculations and project than your MBA students. And then they were right, because if you don't train people, how are you going to, you can't have autonomy without competence. So, yeah, so I saw that. I went, very interesting. So just about, and this is, let's maybe end here. But what I also realized, Aidan, is basically everything we know, everything we've learned, everything you read, but almost every management expert, business author, academic, everything we know, we learned inside of organizations that fit the old time. And all the assumptions we make about what our organizations are capable of or not capable of or whatever, it's a little bit, if all economics came out of people working in a centrally planned economy, what would we really know about economics? Maybe not that much, right? Or only a sliver. And so when I hear, I've had great mentors, people like Jim March at Stanford, others that I interact with, and they all tell me, well, our organizations can only be so good because this is just the reality. As if that reality is like a cosmological constant, right? Rather than just a stick we made for our own back. So the moment you realize, okay, we got ourselves into this mess, maybe we can get ourselves out, that's when you start to be hopeful.
And like you say, and we talked about before, is somebody just made this up someday. So you can make up something else, and it just happens to be that these people were the founders and they had more autonomy. Same for Whole Foods, we talked about. Same for William Gore, Bill Gore and his wife setting up the company. So they just made up a different model, and because they own the company, they back that model. I just wanted to say,
but they start with the same set of principles. They start with that same, the same deep commitment to maximizing freedom with the goal of maximizing accomplishment and contribution, and trying to get everything out of the way. Anyway, we'll flesh this all out, but yeah, we don't have to live with what we've done.
And one thing I want to say is many people inside companies, they blame their manager. And one of the things you call out as well, I don't know the exact research, but it was a Gallup poll you mentioned. I think there's 70% of people are disengaged or something like that. It's a huge number anyway, whatever it is. We know that. But they would maybe think, oh, it's because I can't speak to my boss. You talk about this. But then it's actually the bosses are also disengaged. 50% plus of U.S. managers.
At least as disengaged as the people working for them. It's oftentimes being a manager is basically you're being asked to be a surrogate parent to adults. And who wants that job, right? It's bad enough trying to tell a teenager what to do. I can tell you, telling your adult children what they think they should do, they're just going to say F off, right? No, my turn now. And so, yeah. And of course, those middle managers are getting it. They're getting the crap from above them. And then so I have a lot of empathy for middle managers, but I want to also help them find better roles and higher value added roles. We'll talk about how to do that because, just because we have so much information now, and with AI and with educated employees and so on, there's just no argument for the number of managers we have. No, people try to make that argument. I hear people making that argument. I don't believe it. We don't. And I have the evidence to back up.
Huge amount of evidence in this book. New edition coming out soon. Gary's actually recording the audiobook over the next couple of weeks, and we're going to cover Nucor and Hire next. Magnificent stories. We've been leading up to Hire. It's been the biggest amount of setting up a company, Gary, over those 14 hours.
And not only Hire, I want to talk about Roche and maybe some others, because we really need confidence that this is possible. And then you can go from here to there. You talk about a company like Morningstar. Well, and they were born that way, right? That was in their DNA from their father. Well, we're going to talk about some companies that weren't born that way, and in some sense, they're the more interesting cases.
Huge amount of great cases to come. And Gary, always a pleasure. Where can people find you for people to reach out? I was laughing at Craig, who listened to the show. It was kind of like that old Remington Steel ad. I like the company so much, I bought it. Craig was, I like Gary so much, I joined his company.
Well, definitely, go to wherever you buy books online. The new edition is already for sale. I think it's out next month. We'll start shipping next month. Again, I think probably half of it is new since the first edition. So even if you bought it, you're going to find a lot more to inspire you. And if you want to share, share the new thing. And maybe next time I can put up a QR code or something else for people who want to go find it. And then, ask me questions on LinkedIn or share some of your own experience, or, you can find me on X. I'm just at Prof. Hamel and GaryHamel.com. So yeah, be in touch and tell me if any of this makes sense to you.
And I'll also link to where to buy the book. And I can attest, I got an early copy of the new book. And unfortunately, I had pre-prepared and read the older copy. So now I have both. So I've got lots of new content as well. Gary Hamel, it's always a pleasure. Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure, Aidan.
I hope you enjoyed another episode of the Gary Hamel series, and I want to thank our sponsor Kyndryl for sponsoring the entire innovation show for the next year. Kyndryl runs and reimagines the technology systems that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses. With a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and lasting competitive edge. You can find Kyndryl at kyndryl.com.